Hi, pleasure to be with you all. Today we'll cover cash flow analysis, internal rate of return, and time value of money. I am your host, Brian Shakarami, and let's get started. So you want to invest in real estate. You've possibly found a potential property and you're wondering what to do. Where do you go from here? How do you decide if it's the right investment for you? That decision making requires a four-pronged approach. So you have to analyze four things basically, starting with the site and property location. And I surmise that you've already done that because you have a location to analyze. But you have to also analyze that location and that particular property for competitiveness. Would that property bring in what the market demands in that area? How does it compare with other similar properties around it or in that submarket? You have to analyze the legal and political aspects of things, meaning as far as permitting, zoning, taxes, and access to resources. Does it have, for example, three-phase electrical around? Is there going to be growth at some point? Would there be anything growing around it, such as other shopping centers or perhaps a big development? Would your property be in an area where there is a barrier to entry for others of its kind to enter? And last but not least, you must do a financial analysis. To do the financial analysis, you must do cash flows. And to do that cash flow analysis, you need to know how much initial investment you're going to put into the property. You need to know what your forecasted sale is, because without that, you kind of can't come up with an internal rate of return. You need to know before you go in there how long you'll be holding that property, so the holding period. You need to know when and how often the cash flows come in, and you also need to know the size of the cash flows. So if you had several properties to consider, you'd have to compare things apples and apples. And the only way that you can compare things apples and apples is if you reduce them to their financial net worth or net present value or internal rate of return. So for each property that you want to consider and compare, you must do a full-blown analysis. And you would need some basic financial tools. And every financial analysis, as we've said before, starts with cash flow, because cash flow is king, as they say. So let's get started with the king. So in a nutshell, every cash flow analysis starts with a T-bar. On the left side, we put the number of years, and on the right side, we place the initial investment, the periodic payments or the cash flows that we receive for those years, and finally, we place the sales proceeds to top it off. This is a good depiction of what we just talked about. On the left is the number of years, on the right is the initial investment, normally a negative number because we're putting money down. And the cash flows from years 1 through year N. Let's say it was 5 years, so it'd be year 1 through 5. And at the end is the sales proceed, and that would also be a positive number. To have a better understanding of these alternatives, we'll consider 5 scenarios. One is everything is the same. The cash flow is the same, holding period and sales proceeds are the same, but the two scenarios have different initial investments. Scenario 2, the only thing that's different are the annual cash flow amounts. And initial investment, holding period, and sales proceeds are the same. For scenario 3, we have different timings of the annual cash flow when the cash flow comes in. However, the initial investment, the holding period, and sales proceeds again are the same. For scenario 5, we have different sales proceeds, but the initial investment is the same, holding period is the same, and the cash flows are the same. And finally, for scenario 5, everything is different for the exception of the holding period. So we'd have different initial investment, different sales proceeds, and different cash flow, but they are kept for the same number of years. Analyzing these would give us a much better perspective of how cash flow works and what information, the type of information it can provide us. So we'll start with scenario 1. Initial investment is the only thing that's different. So $1,000 for investment 1, $2,000 for investment 2. But as you see, all the cash flows are the same at $500, and the sales proceed is $2,000 for both of them. Which is the better investment? For scenario 2, as you can observe, the initial investment is the same, the sales proceeds are the same, and the number of years of holding are the same. The only thing that's different are the annual cash flows. One investment gets $250 per year. The other investment gets $500 per year. Which is the better investment? Scenario number 3. Initial investment and sales proceeds are the same. Number of holding years are the same. Even the cash flows are the same. But the timing of the cash flows is the only thing that's different. Which investment is the better investment? Scenario 4, the only thing that's different is the sales proceed. Investment 1 sells for $1,500, investment 2 sells for $2,000. Holding period is the same, cash flow is the same, and initial investment is the same. Which is the better investment? And finally, scenario 5, everything is different for the exception of the number of holding years. For both investments 1 and 2, we hold them for 5 years. However, the initial investment is different, annual cash flow is different, and the sales proceeds are different. Which is the better investment? Let's find out. But first, we need to understand a couple of concepts. And those are discount rates and internal rate of return, or IRR. Without gaining any interest on your money, the value of your money goes down in time. So your $100 today will not buy you the same things a year from now. A year from now, your $100 buys you probably a lot less than what it buys today. So in time, the value of your money goes down. Why? Because of inflation. In general, for example, a gallon of milk today would cost less than it would a year from now. So therefore, prices get inflated. But if you have the same dollar, as prices go up, you won't be able to buy as much. So you can say as time passes, money loses its value. By the same token, your $100 of last year was worth more than your $100 today. And that is precisely because of inflation. That's why when you put your money in the bank, they pay you some interest. And that interest should be at least a hedge against inflation. So if the bank is paying you a 10% interest, your $100 today will be worth, for a simple interest, $110 a year from now. That 10% interest helps project the value of your money into the future, and the future being $110. So I look at the interest as a forward projecting tool. So if I had $100 today and the bank gave me a 5% monthly interest, a year from now I would have $164.70. So that interest rate of 5% is a way for me to project what my $100 would be worth a year from now. By the same token, the reverse of it is true. If I am sitting into the future a year from now and I have $164.70 and I knew that the bank was paying a 5% monthly interest, I could calculate that a year ago I had $100 in the bank, so that I would have $164.70 today. Therefore, I'd have to discount that $164.70 to get to today's money. So therefore, an interest rate and discount rate are basically one and the same. Why do we use a discount rate? It is because when you hold a property for, let's say, 5 years, and you sell it at the end of 5 years, the money that you get 5 years into the future has to be discounted back to the present or to today in order to be able to compare things apples and apples. And all your cash flows must be brought back to today's dollars. The cash flow that you get in year 1, in year 2, year 3, year 4, or year 5, that's 5 years into the future. It needs to be brought back into the present time. And that's the only way that you can get a present value of your investment. And if you're wanting to compare investments, you have to find the present value of all those investments. So you can say that present value and discount rate kind of go hand in hand. And while interests help project today's dollars into the future, a discount rate helps with the reversion of tomorrow's dollars back into today's dollar or the present value. The internal rate of return, or IRR, is the return that you're getting while your money is sitting in your property. So when you put your money in a bank, the interest rate that the bank pays you is your rate of return. However, when you have your money in the real estate, it's the rate of return that that property gives you while your money sits in that real estate. And in order to figure that out, you must have a beginning and you must have an end. Meaning you must have the purchase and you must project a sales price for a certain number of years to be able to calculate an internal rate of return. So therefore, for now, there are two mechanisms for comparing different investment alternatives. One being the net present value, and two being the internal rate of return, or both. So now that we've discussed all this, let's go back and take another look at our 5 scenarios again. Scenario 1, initial investment is the only thing that's different. And when you run the numbers, the NPV, which is the net present value, is 3,500. And the internal rate of return is 56.71%. However, for scenario 2, the net present value is 2,500 and the internal rate of return is 25%. What we'd want to do is go with the option that has the higher net present value or the internal rate of return. And that's clearly investment 1. However, I don't even have to run the numbers here. I can see that for the 5 years of periodic payments or of 500 for each of those investments, which is the same, and the sales price, which is 2,000 for investment 1 and 2, I can see that I'm only putting down 1,000 for investment 1, but I have to put 2,000 for investment 2. This is a no-brainer. I would go with investment 1. I put down less and I still sell it for the same amount and I still get the same periodic payments. Scenario 2, annual cash flows is the only difference. So the periodic payments on investment 1 is 250, on investment 2 is 500. I'm getting a much higher payment for investment 2 than I am on investment 1. And I've put down $1,000 for the purchase of it and I'm selling it for $1,000. So again, the net present value would dictate which one is the best scenario. The one with the higher net present value is the winner, clearly. In this case, investment 2 would be the one that we would pick. However, without even running the numbers, I can see that I put $1,000 down and I get 1,000 at the end, but I get $250 more each year with investment 2. So this would also be a no-brainer to go with investment 2. Scenario 3, the timing of these periodic payments is the only thing that's different. So we purchase them for $1,000 and we sell it for $1,000, let's say. But under investment 1, we get $250 at the end of year 1. But with investment number 2, we get $250 at the end of year 5. And when you run the NPVs or net present values, you see that the net present value is the same for both of them. However, here's where the internal rate of return is different, because for investment 1, the return is 5.55%, but for investment 2, it's 4.56%. That is because when you receive that $250 at the end of year 1, you are making an interest for years 2, 3, 4, and 5. But when you receive the $250 at the end of year 5, you're not making any interest. So this one is also a no-brainer to pick which one is the best one. Clearly, scenario 1 is the best one. You want those periodic payments earlier. You want it more and you want it earlier. Scenario 4. The sales proceed is the only difference. So you get $500 more for investment 2 than you would for investment 1. Otherwise, the initial payment for both is $1,000 and the periodic payments or annual payments are about $500 for each. Which would be the best one? So when you run the NPV, obviously the NPV for investment 2 would be more, $3,500. So would the internal rate of return. But you can kind of look at that and tell, because you're putting the same amount of money down, you're getting the same annual income, but you sell it for a higher price, you would obviously have a higher return. And finally, scenario 5. For this one, the only thing that's the same is the number of years you hold this particular property or investment. Everything else is different. The down payment for investment 1 is $1,000, for investment 2 is $1,200. The sales price for investment 1 is $1,500, for investment 2 is $1,300, and annual payments vary. And some of it is negative, which means maybe you have to pay for certain things. For this one, you would have to run the numbers because it would be a little more difficult and complicated to just look at it and determine which one the best option is. So when you run the NPV and the IRRs, you find that the net present value, again, on both of them is the same. However, the internal rate of return on investment 1 is 17.16%, but for investment 2, it is 15.66%. So clearly you would want to go with investment 1 to get a higher rate of return. Here's a summary of the 5 scenarios we just discussed. So obviously, when you look at a scenario or an investment, you'd run the net present value and you would run the internal rate of return. Even if the net present value was the same, you would pick the one with the higher internal rate of return. We just covered cash flow modeling and the net present value and internal rate of return. And if we run into real life scenarios, this is what we should be looking for. 1, lower initial investment. 2, earlier cash flows because you'd get interest on them. 4, having larger cash flows coming in, and obviously higher sales price. If you have any questions regarding what we discussed, please drop me a note to the following email. Thank you.